When I was 22, I got a job in New York City, but since I was living in New Jersey, commuting every day wasn't really an option. I needed to find somewhere to live in the city, but my budget was tight. So, when I found a cheap room available in an apartment in Hell's Kitchen on Craigslist, I decided to go check it out. The next day, I took a trip to the city to view the place, and the landlord gave me a brief tour. He was a bit awkward socially, but that didn't bother me much. The only catch was that the apartment came with a roommate. The landlord described him as quiet and reclusive, which he said was a positive thing. The roommate's name was Bren. The landlord knocked on Bren's door to introduce us, but there was no response. The landlord guessed that he might be napping. So we moved on and sat in the living room, where I expressed interest in renting the room. I filled out an application, and the following day, the landlord called and offered me the room. I decided to move in the next week. My dad helped me move my stuff into my new room, but something felt off. Throughout the entire time we were unloading the van, Bren never came out, even though it was clear he was home. I could hear him moving around in his room. I had a feeling right away that he wasn't going to be a friendly type, and that turned out to be true. Once my dad left and I was officially on my own, I tried to settle in. I watched Netflix on my laptop, but then I heard Bren's door open and close. This seemed like the perfect opportunity to finally meet him. I got out of bed to say hello, but by the time I made it to the door, I heard the front door slam shut. I stepped out into the living room, but there was no sign of Bren. It was weird. I figured we'd have to meet eventually, but at that moment, I decided to go back to my room, eat some ramen, and call it a night. That evening, things took a turn. I woke up to the sound of the front door closing again, followed by footsteps that came toward my room. The footsteps stopped right outside my door, and I could see the outlines of feet through the crack at the bottom of the door. I didn't know what to make of it, but I didn't want to make a scene. I just waited for him to leave, hoping he wasn't going to try to come inside. After what felt like forever, he finally walked away and returned to his room, shutting his door behind him. I still had no idea what he was doing in there, but all night long, I heard strange thumping noises coming from his room. It was unsettling, but I didn't feel like I could go knock on his door to ask him to be quieter since we hadn't even properly met yet. The next morning, I woke up and it seemed like Bren had already left, probably out at work. I spent the day shopping for groceries and other essentials. When I got back to the apartment, I dropped my bags on the couch to take a break. I made some dinner and watched more Netflix, all the while. Bren still hadn't come home. I went out again to grab some toothpaste from a nearby 7-Eleven. And when I returned, I noticed that his door was slightly ajar, and the light was on. I thought maybe this would be my chance to finally say hello, so I knocked lightly and pushed the door open. What I saw inside shocked me. The room was completely empty except for a single chair in the corner, the kind of chair you'd find in a high school classroom. My heart started racing. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I felt like something was terribly wrong. I turned off the light, shut the door, and went back to my room, feeling uneasy. As I sat on my bed, I began to feel a headache coming on. I took out my phone and decided to call the landlord to get some answers. But just as I dialed, I heard a loud ringing sound coming from my closet. My blood ran cold. The phone rang twice, then went to voicemail. That's when I realized the landlord's phone was in my closet, and he had declined my call. A sick realization hit me all at once. The landlord was in my closet, and there had never been a Bren. I felt a wave of panic and ran to the bathroom, locking myself in. I called the police, and they arrived shortly, searching the entire apartment. Sure enough, they found the landlord hiding under my bed. It turned out that this man wasn't even a real landlord. He didn't own the apartment, and there had never been a lease. I never got the full story of how he had gotten the keys, but it was clear that I had been living in a dangerous situation. I tried to press charges for trespassing and attempted to get out of the lease, but I quickly learned that there was no official lease to break. The whole thing had been a scam. The next day, I had my dad come to help me move all my things back home. I found another apartment a week later, but the whole experience was incredibly unsettling. From the moment I met the landlord, I could tell something was off, but I never imagined just how far the situation would go. I found a listing on Zillow for a shared apartment near the chicken farm where I worked. Since it was conveniently located, already furnished, and reasonably priced, I decided to move in. All I needed to bring was my clothes and a small dresser. The room I rented already had a bed. The landlord, Ben, was an elderly man in his 70s. There wasn't a formal lease. I paid him weekly, and he was essentially more of a roommate than a traditional landlord, despite the age difference. He had an old-fashioned way of doing things, including covering all household costs in the rent. For someone like me, from a modest background, it was an incredible deal. One evening, after a long shift at work, I came home, collapsed into bed, and quickly fell asleep. However, I was soon awoken by the sound of my bedroom door opening. The light from the hallway spilled into the room, and there, standing in the doorway, was Ben. He was holding the doorknob, and in a hoarse, deep voice told me, "Stay out of the basement." He claimed he knew that I had been down there. I assured him that I hadn't, because I genuinely hadn't, and he shut the door and walked downstairs. As I lay there, I couldn't help but think that this guy must be a little unhinged. The next day, I had the day off from work, and Ben took his old car out, probably to run errands. With him gone, I found myself staring at the basement door. I knew it was the basement door because I'd seen him go down there before. His strange warning about not going down there kept nagging at me, and though I had no real desire to check it out before, I now felt compelled. I figured that since he wouldn't be home for a while, I could take a quick look. I opened the basement door and was met with pitch-black darkness, but I found the light switch and flicked it on. The basement seemed normal at first, but then I noticed a door in the far corner. I felt an odd urge to open it, and when I did, I was met with a scene that I can only describe as a nightmare. The door was hard to open, as it had some sort of rubber seal under it, which I assumed was meant to block out an awful smell. But when I finally got it open, I could hardly believe my eyes. Inside, there were blood stains on the concrete floor and black garbage bags stacked in the corner. The bags were large enough to possibly contain bodies or body parts. The stench of decaying flesh filled the room, and I had to fight the urge to puke right there. In the corner of the room, I noticed a camera, mounted in the top right, aimed down at a workbench. I quickly snapped a photo of the room as evidence, then hurried out of there as fast as I could. I went upstairs, packed all my belongings into a garbage bag, and suddenly heard the sound of the front door slamming downstairs. Ben was back. I tried to stay calm and greeted him from the upstairs hallway, but he didn't respond. I heard him go into the basement and then stomp downstairs. This was my chance to leave, so I quickly made a run for my car. I didn't even glance back as I drove off, heading 15 miles to my brother's farm. Once there, I showed him the picture I'd taken. He immediately told me I was foolish for not calling the authorities sooner, so I called 911 and explained everything. I told them that I had been renting from Ben and had accidentally stumbled upon the horrible scene in his basement. I urged them to get a search warrant before Ben had a chance to cover up the evidence. A few hours later, a sheriff's deputy came to my brother's farm to take my information. They reassured me that Ben had been arrested, and he hadn't been able to clear out the basement fast enough. The deputies didn't go into detail about what exactly they found in those black bags, but I could tell from the way they spoke that it was serious. They thanked me for my help and left. My brother let me stay with him for a few weeks while I figured out my next steps. Eventually, I began searching for another place to live, but I couldn't shake the nightmare I had just escaped from. It was a huge relief knowing that Ben was no longer a threat, but I couldn't help wondering how long he had been operating like this. The whole experience was horrifying, but at least I had gotten out in time. When I started college, I'm sure many of you can relate to that experience of walking into your dorm room for the first time and meeting your roommate, the person you're going to live with for the next year or so. I definitely remember mine. I walked into the room and found my roommate there. He had fair skin, black hair, glasses, and a slightly feminine-sounding voice. There was nothing wrong with any of that, but from the moment I met him, he gave off a distinct gamer vibe. To be honest, it wasn't the type of person I thought I'd click with. What first threw me off was his handshake. It was limp, like a dead fish. That made me think he probably wasn't someone I'd easily get along with. I'll call him John for the sake of the story. After meeting him, I decided to go around the floor and introduce myself to the other people living there. I ended up hitting it off with some of the others more than I did with John, but I was still open to trying to get to know him. The first night was spent unpacking, and we ended up spending some time in the room, hanging out. I didn't think he was a bad person. He just didn't seem to know how to carry on a conversation. I'd try asking him questions about himself, but he'd respond with one-word answers or say things that didn't really make sense. It wasn't that he was rude, he just seemed socially awkward. To make things even more awkward, he went to bed really early, like by 10 p.m. everyone else was still awake, and no one had any early classes the next day. So it struck me as a little strange. I put in my headphones and watched videos on my phone until about midnight, then finally went to sleep. The next morning, after having breakfast with some of the other guys on the floor, I returned to my room and noticed something strange. My duffel bag had been moved. I didn't know what was missing, but the bag definitely felt lighter. I turned to John, who was sitting on his bed, and asked him if he had been through my bag. He immediately became defensive, denying it in an aggressive tone. I didn't have any proof. There were no cameras in the room, and I didn't want to make a bigger deal out of it, so I dropped it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next night, I decided to invite John to join me and some of the other guys on the floor for a night out, but he refused, saying he needed to stay on top of his work. So I went out without him. When I came back, he was already fast asleep in his bed. It was pretty late, so I just went to sleep as well. That night, there was a heavy rainstorm outside. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of thunder crashing, but I was too lazy to look out the window. Even with my eyes closed, I could see the constant flashes of lightning. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The flashes almost like a lullaby in a weird way. The next morning, I found that my backpack had been moved again, and it was open. This time, I didn't say anything to John. I figured I'd wait and see if I could catch him in the act. So that night, I stayed up a little longer than usual. I listened to the rain outside and kept my eyes closed, pretending to sleep. Around 1 or 2 a.m., I heard movement from John's bed. I didn't open my eyes, but I could tell he was sitting up. Then I saw flashes of light again, but this time I realized something. It wasn't lightning. It was him taking pictures of me. I quickly turned to my other side, pretending I hadn't noticed. In that brief moment, I saw him trying to put his phone down quickly, but not before I saw the flash again. I couldn't believe it. I turned to him and said, "What are you doing?" He stammered, saying he couldn't sleep. It didn't take a genius to figure out that something was off. The next day, I told the other guys on the floor what had happened, and they all agreed that I should ask for a room change. I decided they were right. When I went back to the room later, John was actually gone, which was surprising since he was usually there. I noticed that his laptop was sitting open on his bed, the lid cracked slightly. My curiosity got the best of me, and I couldn't resist snooping. I opened the laptop and was immediately met with a chaotic desktop full of folders, programs, and images. It was the messiest desktop I'd ever seen. I started opening some of the pictures, thinking they might be weird but harmless, but then I came across something truly disturbing. There were pictures of me in bed, taken with his iPhone using the flash. He had stored them all on his computer, along with pictures of my duffel bag and the inside of my backpack. It made my stomach turn. I quickly recorded a video of the laptop screen and deleted every single picture I could find. Once I was sure everything was gone, I closed the laptop and immediately took the video to the dorm's administration. I requested a new roommate, and they assured me they'd handle it. I didn't know how John was disciplined by the school, but I was told I'd be moved across campus to a new room the next day. That night, though, I couldn't sleep. I heard the springs of John's mattress creaking in the middle of the night as he got up from bed. Then there was complete silence. After a while, I heard a soft exhale from above me. I just knew he was standing over my bed. I didn't dare turn around, too terrified to even make a sound. Less than a minute later, I heard the mattress springs creak again, and then it was silent the rest of the night. The next morning, I moved into my new room with a new roommate who was normal, friendly, and a complete relief. But even now, I still get creeped out thinking about John and what he had been doing. The fact that he still had all those pictures of me sleeping on his phone makes my skin crawl. I'll never know exactly what his goal was with those pictures, or why he felt the need to stand over me in the middle of the night. All I know is that he was one seriously messed up creep, and I'm just glad I got out of there before things got even worse. When I moved out of my parents' house, my dad's friend Kathy was renting out an apartment with 2 bedrooms. She offered me a great deal, but the catch was I'd have to share the space with a woman she had found to rent the other room. Kathy was a bit short on cash, so I understood the situation. When I moved in, Kathy introduced me to the woman, whose name was Betty. Betty was around 60 years old, and I have to admit, it felt a little odd living with someone who could almost be my grandmother. Since Kathy was just subletting the apartment, the place was already furnished, and I only had to bring my bed and dresser. Things started to feel off on the second night. I was sitting in the living room, watching TV, when I noticed Betty's head peek around the corner from the hallway. She stared at me with an intense look, and then she began muttering strange, almost incoherent sounds. I was concerned and asked her if she was okay. She just groaned and disappeared back into the hallway. I immediately called Kathy and asked if there was something wrong with Betty. Kathy assured me that as far as she knew, Betty was fine. She said she'd only met her about a week ago. When I described what had happened, Kathy seemed surprised, but I figured I'd just chalk it up to Betty being a little odd. The next morning, I ran into Kathy again while she was cooking breakfast. I said good morning, and then asked her if Betty had seemed okay the night before. I explained how she had been staring at me and making strange noises. Kathy looked confused, claiming she didn't remember any of it. I was left wondering if Betty was going through some kind of mental health episode or even a psychotic break. A few nights later, things took an even stranger turn. I was in my room, sitting on my bed with the lights off, using my laptop. I suddenly heard a knock at my bedroom door, followed by the same groaning sounds I had heard before. I muted my laptop and tried to ignore it, but the knocking wouldn't stop. The door wasn't locked, but I was too uncomfortable to open it, especially after what had happened the night before. I just waited in silence, hoping it would end. After what felt like an eternity, the knocking finally stopped, and I could hear her walking away. At this point, I started feeling a little freaked out. These bizarre episodes seemed to happen only at night, and I wanted to lock the door, but the bedroom door didn't have a lock. Still, once she left, I felt safe enough to go to sleep. I woke up thinking it was around 9:00 a.m., but to my surprise, it was pitch black. I checked my clock. 1:30 a.m. I had been woken by a creak in the floor, and when I looked up, I saw a figure standing at the edge of my bed. It was Betty. I called out her name, and then I heard the groaning again. I turned on the lamp beside my bed and froze in horror. There she was, this 60-something-year-old woman, her long gray hair a mess, looking like a half-woken psycho. The first thing I noticed, though, was the large knife in her hand. I screamed as loudly as I could and scrambled into the corner of my bed, terrified she would attack me. But instead, she just kept groaning, as though unaware of what she was doing, and then she left the room. I quickly shut the door and shoved the dresser against it to block it. My heart was pounding, and I tried calling Kathy, but she didn't answer, likely still asleep. I had no choice but to get through the night. It was one of the longest, most terrifying 6 hours I've ever experienced. When the sun finally came up, I called Kathy at 8 o'clock and told her everything. I demanded that she evict Betty immediately. Kathy couldn't believe it at first, but she apologized and said she'd come over that day to talk to Betty. However, because Kathy was subletting, she couldn't just evict her on the spot. It would take time, as evictions usually do. Kathy suggested that I leave the apartment and find somewhere else to stay while she dealt with Betty. The situation got even more unsettling when Betty apologized, claiming she had no recollection of any of the strange behavior. Kathy and I did some research and found that Betty was most likely suffering from a condition called sundowning syndrome. This disorder causes people, particularly the elderly, to become disoriented, confused, or aggressive late in the day, often after the sun goes down. Knowing this, it was terrifying to think that, in her confused state, Betty might have genuinely intended to come into my room with that knife and hurt me for some unknown reason.